talking to this fundraiser, right, this capital campaign manager, about, you know, how do we put together a program that raises money? Yeah. Like, how do we put together the pieces and the networking and the fundraising elements? So, like, are we really going to do wine and oysters? Are we really going to do origami folding? Like, what are we going to do that actually is our fundraising efforts? Yeah. I do have the GoFundMe. Like, I've done some fundraising, and I have been out there, you know, through the community, but having a person really focused on it seems like a really good idea to me. Yeah. Now, obviously, he's expensive, right? Like, that's the trade-off here, right? Like, you got to have money to make money. That's the classic. So I'm thinking about, you know, raising money to be able to raise money, right? So now I'm thinking about how do I write a grant to afford the capital campaign? And now I just had a lovely conversation this morning with somebody who's starting a museum on Oahu. And it is amazing how parallel our journeys are, where they have some opportunity within a developer to do a bigger museum, but they've said, let's get started with a smaller museum, doing their pop-up. Let's get some small funding, let's get the footprint, let's get it out to the community. So we're actually on such parallel tracks. She's hoping to be open in November. I feel like I'm on day for day slip right now, but
what type of museum?
So they're doing a, they call it the Museum of Innovation, and it's really almost like a Hawaii Hall of Fame, I would call it. Okay. I sort of used those terms with her. I don't know that she would 100% agree with that characterization, but the idea of who are all the people that have really contributed to Hawaii as military contributions, as political contributions, actors and movie stars, famous senators, you know, they have sort of all these categories and all these different things. But it's very much the biographies, the understanding of these heroes who are from Hawaii. They have a very strong board of directors. They're very politically connected. They have maybe the same amount of fundraising as us or less, and a longer term horizon for even starting their fundraising campaign. So it's interesting to be sort of on such parallel tracks.
When I started a business 15 years ago, I was thinking about very different things than I think about now, right? Like, the reason that I'm picking something is different than I would today. When we were having that bank discussion, I was like, I haven't thought about choosing a bank in a while, but it's something I should revisit. When you're starting a business, what are the reasons you should choose a bank, right? So I kind of went down this long rabbit hole.
Just with yourself,
Today, why would I choose a bank? 15 years ago, I chose a bank because I wanted it to be as little of fees as possible. I really like to drive through to make my deposits easier. You know, like, those were the things that I was thinking of, right? Yeah. And today I have more concern. I'm thinking about a business that's going to affect more people. I have more concern about, like, privacy and what tools that the bank might offer online, or, you know, those sorts of things.
So speaking of grant writing, the grant that's on the table right now that I'm pushing around is this Department of Commerce grant. So apparently the Department of Commerce has sort of annual appropriations. So October is their fiscal year. So at the beginning of October, they get appropriated funds that they then can go out into the world and allocate. And so I was wondering, you know, I went and I applied to them and said, hey, I'm looking for, you know, some money to tide me over and help me, you know, get some seed money, get off the ground. And, you know, it's public works, it's public infrastructure, right? This is going to be an educational space that's open to the public. This is going to be helping with workforce development and really elevating our community. And they said, you know, so they actually called me back very quickly, which none of the other federal agencies have ever called me back, much less quickly. And set up a meeting, and we had a whole face-to-face Zoom conversation for like an hour and a half. We talked about all kinds of details, and they were very honest about it. There were two guys. What they've seen in the past, what kind of grants have gotten through, what kind of the angle to take is, what the approach is. And then I sort of asked them very candidly about, well, your funding cycle, like, you have this pot of money, are you about to run out? Where are you? And he goes, oh, don't even worry about that. If we like you and like your proposal and we approve it, even if we don't have any money, we just put it until October and you get funded then. And then we just roll it forward. And I was like, well, this is great, like, insight, information into how this particular funding source operates and what their deadlines and their cycles are. And it's been very difficult to find out that kind of information for some of the other grant sources, but I was thrilled that Department of Commerce was so open. So then, talking to the other museum professional this morning, she mentioned, and I had just finished writing a bunch of letters to like the state senators and the state house and the state representatives and all my local, politicians, and she said, no, you got to go talk to the federal senators, because when you're talking about a federal grant, and even something like Department of Commerce, the federal senators have staff members that can go talk to those folks, like directly in Washington DC, like go, shake hands and knock on doors and do that kind of stuff. So she says, absolutely, write to the federal senators, let them know that you have this grant that you've asked for, that you want their help to oversee the process and help it along, and that you're still looking for funding, right? Just tell them that you're looking for funding, because, here in Hawaii, her historical perspective is so much of our funding has come from the federal government. So much of our infrastructure, everything from NELHA to, Senator Inouye was the one that really, got the Bishop Museum started, got Imaloa started. Really, he was just bringing in federal money to bring Hawaii these public works projects. And so she said, you have to just connect to our senators. It's like a foregone conclusion that federal money will come and it will flow through them. They will be the shepherds, and they will be more than happy to bring it here, right? They will be more than happy to help you fundraise. So I can't believe that I'm like just cracking this particular nut now, but it's
I would have no idea.
Nice to finally have some like insider information.
I mean, if you think of it for like 5 seconds after you told that, it does make a lot of sense. Like,
and looking around, yes, right.
It's
A lot
like-
of our infrastructure came from federal funding.
It's like, oh yeah, like, I think there's the federal part, the state part.
Yes. And I've applied to county, right? So I've tried all the private individuals. I've tried all of these, the Atherton Family Foundation, all these private, and the banks, right? The banks are another funding sort of pot. So it's funny, I've got this capital campaign specialist, and I'm already well into the weeds of what are the fundraising sources. I'm just not having the success I want. I'm not disciplined enough to be like, okay, here's my timeline, here's my calendar, here's how much I'm going to raise, and here's the people I'm going to contact, and all the things that he's going to bring to the table. So his campaign management approach really will bring structure instead of this sort of haphazard, I was just talking to this lady this morning and just found out about this whole vein that I haven't even thought of mining before, right? Like, so I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to having some focus and some people dedicated to the fundraising. Because right now it just takes so much time. All the grant writing, everything takes time.
Yeah.
Looking at Mazie, Senator Mazie, so this is federal Senator Mazie's list.
Hirono?
And I have been following up on these grant opportunities that her staff have identified. And she obviously has a lot of people working on this. And I don't know why I never thought of like reaching out to her office directly and saying, hey, I'm actually applying to these things. I'm using your newsletter. Last week we printed out all those flyers, right? And I sent it to everybody, right? So everybody, it went out the door. It was like, not sure that it was going to work. I didn't know what the process was like. I show up at the post office, or I did everybody that lives on a particular postal route right near the museum. Office, I've got this box. They're all individually wrapped, and they have their little stickers, and they've got the rubber bands on. And I'm like, "Is this good? Are we there?" And they're like, "Yes, we know how to do this." I'm like, "Okay, yes." I was half expecting them to say, "Oh, we don't do that in Hawaii," right? Because it's like so common. But they did it. They took it, and so they've delivered, a bazillion little flyers. And I do believe I got one person writing back to me right away saying, "I'm here to support you," blah blah blah. So I think that person got it from this flyer. And something that I learned like at the last minute, right before we hit print on those flyers, was when you do a marketing campaign like that, you want to be able to collect a metric, like how many people saw my flyer, right? And how do you build those metrics in? So what they told me to do was to put on the card, bring this card to the museum for free admission, right? Because then we'll start to see how many people actually squirreled these things away and kept it and read it, right? And so over the next, 6 months, year, 18 months, how many of these cards start to show up in the system? So, in Square, I go in and I say, I've created a discount, which is one free admission if they bring the card. And so then we'll actually be able to track that. And the Square database is where we will track the data, and then
brilliant.
we'll actually have the information someday. I just got into the Philanthropy News Digest. So Candid is one of those like database organizations that covers grant opportunities everywhere in the world. We're going to aggregate them all here, right? And so they're this massive database, Candid. And usually you have to have like a username, login, password, account, either with a school or with the federation, and they charge you, you know, $4,000 a year, some fee to get into their system, right? Because it's all, you know, protected money. But here on this island, the Hawaii Community Foundation did get me an account, which may not be like all of Candid, but it's part of it. So I do have some access to the Grant Connection database, so I can look up grants that are not just in the Federal Register, but are in other locations. And then I started getting this newsletter, which is Candid's newsletter. And of course, look at the second thing on the thing, which is Melinda Gates is not going to put all of her money into the Gates Foundation, and instead, she's going to put all of her money into girls in STEM. So I'm like, all right, the newsletter is already interesting to me. It's only the second article I've ever, never ever read, and I've heard of this. So she's putting all of her work into this company called Pivotal Ventures. And when I looked at Pivotal Ventures, so she says, I think philanthropy is more effective when it prioritizes flexibility over ideology. This Pivotal Ventures company is an incubation company promoting gender equality in the United States with a focus on women in technology and innovation, women and girls of color. It's right up our alley. So newsletter subscription that might actually be yet another funding vein. And I'm excited that there's more opportunities out there. Because I have a very detailed calendar, right? I have a very organized list of all the grants for the whole calendar year, when they're due, when they're going to come due next, so that I can look ahead next month and be like, okay, I got to start writing the grants for the next months. But it's nice to be able to keep.
You know, I mentioned to you before, like I've always shied away from grants, and I mean, on a personal note, I'll avoid a loan like the plague if I can, because you're always beholden.
You're thinking like a for-profit business.
So none of the grants require you to do anything for the grant?
Not particularly. Now,
Or
when you write
collect
the
any,
grant,
you're like, I don't know. Okay.
sometimes they want like a report, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes they want to see where their funds went. And they do often have strings on them like, this money cannot be used for religious organizations or for individuals or to compensate construction workers on the job or whatever. They'll have their strings.
Mm-hmm.
So each grant, you have to read the fine print and understand, okay, I'm fitting within the terms of the grant. The proposal that I submit is for building exhibits. Some people will say, sorry, that's a capital improvement, you can't have that. Some people will say, oh, it's art installation, it's all good, right? So it's like the grant funder, each one has its own approach for things. Some will say, I'm going to submit this grant, I'm asking for operational expenses. Sometimes rent is allowed, sometimes rent is excluded. So I've got my spreadsheet here, I've got all my notes, who the grant sources are, what the description is, how much the grant is allowed to ask for, when the deadlines are, when I expect to hear back from them, and then all my notes year after year about what I did or didn't do, and when did I submit it, and all this stuff. So how many grants have I got on my list now? 64 grants. So every year I can go through and submit these 64 grants and keep iterating once a year. But for example, this year, so last year I did the Atherton Family Foundation, and I did receive funding from them. So I owe them a report. In October, I have to give them a report on how I spent the money that they did give me. Unrestricted use of the funds, so there was nothing specific. But I discovered, in talking to more people and learning about the Atherton Family Foundation, they're not big into, like I said, should I just apply again next year? Like, I've received one. Is it greedy to then reapply next year? Like, what's the perception? What is the Atherton Family Foundation's take on this? And they said they are one of the organizations that does hesitate to keep giving you funding year after year after year after year. Mm-hmm. But if you were to change it, for example, if they're the one that I go and I say, hey, I want to do a capital campaign, will you fund the capital campaign so that I can then go do fundraising? They are more than happy to do something like that. So last year I asked them for seed funding for the building. This year I asked them for something different. I'm asking them for fundraising funds. This particular organization would be interested. So I have to make notes and I have to keep it all straight, who's doing what, all of this kind of information, rather than simply turning the crank on these things and simply spitting out the same report year after year. I want to make sure that I'm following up, you know, dusting things off, cleaning them up and submitting it next year in a way that's going to get their attention and in a way that they would, you know, be open to, okay, well, they want to do a capital campaign. We think that's a good idea for this organization. Let's help them along that line.
Mahalo, aloha, shaka.